Thomas Aquinas spent much of his life studying some of the most difficult questions in the Christian faith. Among them was one mystery that has fascinated believers for centuries. Who is the Antichrist? Countless books have tried to answer that question. Some point to powerful rulers, others speculate about future world events. Every generation seems convinced that it is living on the edge of the final deception. But Thomas Aquinas approached the subject differently. Instead of asking who the Antichrist would be, he first asked how the Antichrist would deceive. That distinction changes everything. Because if Christians spend all their time searching for a person, they may overlook the very deception that prepares the world to receive him. According to Thomas Aquinas, the greatest danger is not recognizing the Antichrist after he appears. The greater danger is failing to recognize the pattern of deception long before that day ever comes. And hidden within his theology is one sign that many Christians have overlooked for centuries. Before revealing that sign, however, there is one truth about evil itself that must first be understood. Without it, nothing else about the Antichrist will make sense. So stay with us until the end, because that overlooked truth may change the way you read every warning in sacred scripture. And before we begin, tell us in the comments, Lord, keep my heart faithful to the truth. Now, let us begin. Before Thomas Aquinas examined the Antichrist, he first examined the nature of evil itself. That was no coincidence. He believed no one could recognize the final deception without first understanding how deception works. Many people imagine evil as the opposite of good, as though the two were equal forces struggling for control of the world. Thomas Aquinas rejected that idea. He taught that evil creates nothing. It has no power to invent truth, produce love, or give life. Only God can do that. Instead, evil survives by corrupting what God has already made good. It imitates truth until truth becomes difficult to recognize. It imitates goodness until goodness is separated from God. That simple principle becomes the key to understanding the Antichrist. Because if evil cannot create, then the Antichrist will not build his kingdom on obvious lies alone. He will begin with something that looks remarkably close to the truth. That conclusion leads to an unexpected question. If evil can only imitate what is good, what would the Antichrist imitate? Thomas Aquinas believed the answer was both simple and unsettling. The greatest deception would not begin with open hatred of Christ. Hatred is too easy to recognize. It would begin with a convincing imitation of what people already believe to be good, a message that sounds compassionate, a promise that sounds hopeful, a vision of peace that appears to unite rather than divide. At first, nothing seems dangerous. That is precisely why so many people could accept it without hesitation. The closer a counterfeit resembles the original, the harder it becomes to detect. And according to Thomas Aquinas, that is exactly how the final deception gains its power. But if the Antichrist appears to promote what is good, how can faithful Christians recognize the difference before it is too late? That question leads to the one sign many believers have overlooked. For Thomas Aquinas, the answer was found in sacred scripture itself. Saint Paul warned that before the return of Christ, a great rebellion would come, and with it, a figure who would deceive many. But Aquinas noticed something important. Scripture does not describe the Antichrist as a man who simply destroys. It describes a man who first deceives. That difference matters. Force can frighten people for a time. Only deception can win their trust. The Antichrist will not persuade the world by making goodness appear evil. He will persuade the world by making evil appear good. That is why Thomas Aquinas believed Christians should pay less attention to dramatic predictions and more attention to the subtle changes taking place within the human heart. Because every great deception begins the same way, not by rejecting Christ outright, but by slowly replacing his truth with something that feels easier to accept. And that brings us to the one sign Thomas Aquinas believed faithful Christians should never ignore. The sign Thomas Aquinas points us toward is not a date, a nation, or a political leader. It is something far more subtle. Whenever goodness is separated from God, deception has already begun. That may be the warning many Christians overlook. Peace is a gift from God. But peace without truth is only an illusion. Love is the greatest commandment. But love without holiness soon becomes permission to ignore sin. Freedom is one of God's greatest gifts. But freedom without obedience to God's law eventually becomes slavery to human desires. Thomas Aquinas believed that every genuine good finds its source in God. Once that source is removed, the good itself begins to lose its true meaning. That is why the Antichrist's greatest weapon is not persecution. It is substitution. He does not ask people to reject goodness. He offers a version of goodness that no longer requires Christ. And that deception is powerful precisely because it appears so reasonable at first. History offers countless examples of this pattern. The first temptation in the Garden of Eden was not an invitation to worship evil. It was an invitation to seek something good in the wrong way. The serpent promised wisdom. He promised fulfillment. He even suggested that Adam and Eve could become more like God. The promise sounded attractive. The path was deadly. Thomas Aquinas believed every major deception follows the same pattern. Error rarely begins with complete falsehood. It begins with a truth that has been subtly distorted. That is why faithful Christians should never ask only whether something appears loving, peaceful, or compassionate. They must also ask a deeper question. Does it lead people closer to Christ? Or does it slowly persuade them that Christ is no longer necessary? That question reveals far more than appearances ever can. And according to Thomas Aquinas, it also explains why even sincere believers can sometimes mistake a convincing counterfeit for the truth itself. That possibility may be the most sobering part of Thomas Aquinas' reflection. The greatest danger is not that evil will deceive those who already reject God. The greater danger is that deception may appear convincing enough to confuse sincere believers. Not because they stop loving Christ, but because they gradually stop measuring every teaching against the truth Christ entrusted to His church. This is why discernment has always been essential to the Christian life. Feelings can be sincere, intentions can be good, popular opinion can sound persuasive. Yet none of these by themselves determine what is true. Thomas Aquinas repeatedly pointed back to a higher standard, sacred scripture faithfully understood, the constant teaching of the Church, and the truth that never changes. Whenever a message asks Christians to set aside those foundations in exchange for something easier, more comfortable, or more acceptable to the world, caution is needed. Because the final deception will not simply ask people to believe a lie. It will invite them to believe they no longer need the fullness of the truth. If Thomas Aquinas leaves us with one lasting lesson, it is this: no deception, no matter how convincing, can overcome the truth of Christ. The Antichrist may imitate goodness. He may imitate justice. He may even imitate religion, but he cannot become Christ. That is why faithful Catholics are never called to live in fear. They are called to remain faithful. Thomas Aquinas believed that every grace necessary for salvation has already been entrusted to the Church through Christ. Those who remain rooted in sacred scripture, nourished by the Eucharist, strengthened through confession, and guided by the constant teaching of the Church, possess everything they need to resist deception. The purpose of studying the Antichrist is not to become fascinated with darkness. It is to become more deeply attached to the light. And that is the one victory no deception can ever take away. Thomas Aquinas never encouraged Christians to become obsessed with identifying the Antichrist. His concern was far greater than satisfying human curiosity. He wanted believers to recognize deception before deception could take root in the heart. That lesson remains just as important today. Every generation wonders whether it is living near the end. Yet every generation faces the same choice. Will truth be measured by Christ? Or will Christ be measured by the changing standards of the world? Perhaps that is the question every Christian should ask before searching for signs in the headlines. The Antichrist, whenever he comes, will not change the gospel. He will offer a substitute for it. And according to Thomas Aquinas, every counterfeit can be recognized by one simple test. Does it lead souls closer to Christ? Or does it slowly persuade them that Christ is no longer enough? That is a question worth asking every day. If this reflection helped you see the warnings of Scripture in a new light, consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who loves the Catholic faith. And before you leave, Write this simple prayer in the comments. Lord, keep my heart faithful to Christ. May that prayer remind each of us that our greatest task is not to fear the Antichrist, but to remain faithful to Jesus Christ until the very end.